Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? As has been the pattern for almost the rest of this year, we will talk about the CCP virus first. One of the more unusual stories this week is that Qingdao, a city in China, is testing all 9 million people who live there. This is after 12 cases were reported. China has been sold as the epitome of a way to solve the spread of the CCP virus, that they are a success story to emulate in all cases. While these claims are highly questionable, we should consider that question even more pronounced now after the massive response by China to what is considerably a small and insignificant number of cases for such a large number of people. This somewhat overblown reaction gives credence to the thought that China is hiding the true numbers behind the outbreak in that country, that we really don't know just how many people have been infected. A massive testing effort that involves 9 million people after 12 cases seems like an overblown reaction and completely disproportionate to the cause. It makes one wonder whether or not they are hiding something more significant, and whether or not they truly have this under control. Next we have whether or not your blood type will dictate some degree of risk to infection by the CCP virus. There is a small but growing body of research that type O blood may give you some benefit during the CCP virus pandemic. Type O is considered one of the rarer blood types across many countries. You may know that type O negative blood is the universal donor, type O being the next best, and type AB being the universal recipient. What we're taking away from this is that it is a relatively rare blood type at the moment. As a consequence, patients with type O blood make up a small proportion of the overall population and therefore are at less risk regardless. It's once you begin standardizing these numbers that an interesting trend occurs. Take note that this trend in most studies is only occurring in small samples of the population. We are talking about fewer than 100 people in most cases. What the researchers found in broad terms is that type O and type B blood are less likely to be infected, or at least have less intensive infections. This means less time in the hospital and quicker recovery. This also means that those with type O blood are less likely to require a ventilator. The ventilators are there for those most serious infections, and often are a consequence of the lungs being inflamed and a loss of function from that. The type O blood leads to nearly 4.5 fewer days in support in a hospital. When you consider that the average time in an intensive care unit is about 14 days, 13.5 to be precise, that initial research is important to then back up what came afterwards. The second study that came out this week involves a massive population sample, nearly 500,000 people. This comes from one of those studies in the European countries that have big databanks that are available for researchers. What they found when exploring this massive data set was that of the 4,600 people who were tested, came up positive, reported their blood type, and were able to then take part in this study, nearly 40% had type O blood. This is significantly lower than the population distribution of type O blood, and that meant they could conclude that there is a significant reduced susceptibility to infection. The risk of infection, at least initially, is one big concern. The other is regarding herd immunity and long-term population immunity. There have been a series of cases involving reinfection from the CCP virus, and this is giving pause to the idea that we might be able to establish immunity simply by gradual exposure by the population to the CCP virus. There have so far been a number of instances where people have been reinfected after having had the CCP virus, being treated or possibly simply recovering due to a mild case, then later on having to be retested due to symptoms reappearing and demonstrating that they had yet again been infected. This means that there's a good chance that either we are seeing one of two events. One, that the virus is mutating and thereby avoiding the immune system's ability to fight it off. Or B, the immune system isn't able to develop the necessary memory to be able to resist the CCP virus in the long term. This is a concern for any attempt to create a vaccine. For example, the current leading Chinese candidate involves developing antibodies. At least in theory, their antibodies will currently be very specific to the strain of the virus that is out there now. That means, at least in theory, if the virus begins to mutate, it may not be effective, and this is one of the risks faced by the current leading candidates and the method they've used. It's also one reason why the influenza vaccine needs to change every year. It needs to be updated to match the mutations seen in the influenza virus strains. Compare this with something like the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. These give someone lifetime immunity purely because the target sites on those pathogens are relatively constant and do not change. This means you can give someone the necessary number of vaccines doses to develop a memory for the pathogen, and from there on they are more than less immune. As we've previously mentioned, this should be a consideration by any government looking to try and develop a vaccine or purchase one. Whatever they do finally decide needs to be able to develop, modify, and cope with new strains of the virus. When we're looking at reinfection, the possible implications of whether or not blood type is a factor and more, we're looking at population level issues here. We then need to look at whether or not someone can get infected to start with. For this, we go to a research group in Australia. They've published what appears to be a very uncomfortable finding. The CCP virus can last for up to 28 days, nearly a full month, on glass and banknotes, and then they have a variety of other surfaces they've tested as well. This means that, at least in theory, there is a 4-week period after when the virus is deposited on something that someone else could theoretically pick it up. It's worth remembering that we say theoretically for one very important reason. Epithelial cells and tissues that make up your skin are designed in such a way as to prevent most, if not all, pathogens from making entry into your body without there being some sort of damage. This could be a scratch, cut, or something more serious. But as a rule, if your skin is intact and makes contact with these surfaces, you should not be able to pick up the virus. It simply can't penetrate the multiple layers of dead cells, then living cells, and then connective tissue to be able to then get into the vascular system where it can travel around the body and infect more cells freely. There are a few caveats to this study. The first one being that it was done in an environment without any natural light. Natural light, and specifically the UV radiation within it, is an extremely good sterilizer. It's one reason why any idea should be made available to the public and natural light in order to have it destroyed if it's a bad idea. This study worked without that beneficial element. They also tested it at points between 1 hour and 28 days. This was also done under varying temperature conditions, these being 20 degrees centigrade, 30 degrees centigrade, and 40 degrees centigrade. After most of the 20 degree samples were tested, they found that just about every surface they tried was still viable many days after the initial test. That was the 28-day window. There were only a few exceptions. This only serves to reinforce the need to wash your hands and maintain hygiene while the pandemic is going on, and preferably afterwards. The study itself has yet to be able to put itself in the context of just who exactly is at risk and how much needs to be present for you to be infected. The concern with the CCP virus is not so much can you pick it up via your hands, but whether or not you are in a situation where you could breathe in the virus particles. That is the primary method of infection. This is why trying to maintain social distancing and wearing a mask are some of the better methods currently available to try and mitigate the spread of the CCP virus. A mask will force most of those virus particles away from someone else. Maintaining social distancing means that anything that does escape is slowed down sufficiently that it can't infect another. This is where an engineer comes in. They've been trying to figure out just where, if you are in a room with other people, you are at risk of catching the CCP virus. This comes from the conversation, and the author of this is an engineer who was conducting experiments on how aerosols can move around. The research highlights one of the flaws in past research, that is, it's normally assumed a homogeneous distribution of the virus particle, which is true of small confined spaces that are saturated with people. When we're talking about larger environments, such as classrooms, which are an increasing concern with a plan to return to in-person or face-to-face teaching in many different countries, we have a different model, and that needs to take into consideration that you do not have that homogeneous distribution of the virus, that it's actually going to be moving around the room in different ways, based on heating and cooling systems along with the movement of people. The summary of their findings is simple. The closer you are to someone who is infected, and if they speak, the higher the risk. This is then further exacerbated by longer-term exposure in that environment also increases risk until it covers the entire room. These are all factors that could be contributing significantly to the way the US continues to break records with the number of CCP cases being diagnosed. 12 states have just made their own records, that is, 12 of the 50 US states. The rising concern with this drastic increase in case count has been that it could be the beginning of a second wave. The second wave was predicted based on simple seasonal changes. As you enter into autumn and winter, people move indoors and students return to school. As there are more people in confined spaces, as has just been noted, there is greater risk of infection. The problem with the second wave would be whether or not America's medical system can continue to cope like it has last time. A second wave wouldn't be building up slowly, but would ramp up more drastically, and in a much shorter time frame. This means more infections quicker. The American healthcare system last time struggled. It managed, but it struggled. If we see an increase again this time, the medical system may not cope and get by as successfully. This is yet another issue on top of the current situation where doctors are seeing an autoimmune-like response to those who have been severely infected by the CCP virus. Autoimmune diseases are diseases which attack the body. The immune system fails to recognize self-based cells, and viral infections are particularly notorious for this. An article published in The Conversation demonstrates how immunologists at a university hospital are finding that this is occurring with patients who are severely infected by the CCP virus. As they describe it, it could be a Pyrrhic victory in that you are cured of the virus, at least temporarily, but the body begins to continue attacking itself after you have removed the virus. This is only further complicated by the fact that there is systemic inflammation, which can then cause damage to a variety of organs and tissues. Lungs and kidneys are particularly notorious targets. This means the normal immunological response to infection could in fact be creating just as many problems as it fixes in some limited but very severe cases of the CCP virus. Patients who are already physically compromised through infection, age, comorbidities, and more. These are compounded by the fact that the infection wears their body out. Having noted that we have issues with some of the current possible front-running treatments, that there are some serious issues with infection, it seems the only long-term resolution to the CCP virus is a vaccine of some sort. Two concerns coming out this week is that 2 of the front-running candidates have had to pause their late-stage clinical trials. These pauses are not necessarily related to adverse events or adverse reactions. In fact, in some cases, the company needs to take a pause after they've collected their initial data, analyzed it themselves, and if they've decided they're going to go forward with the next stage, which is most likely getting preliminary approval, they need to outsource their analyses to an independent and completely impartial party to consider whether or not the conclusions they've reached are valid. It could also be related to those adverse and unexpected events, specifically unexplained illnesses in certain patients. Those unexplained illnesses could also be unrelated to the vaccine if they were receiving the placebo arm. It could also be that because they have increased the number of participants, that they're beginning to find that they are observing adverse events that they simply did not anticipate. Consider that at least one of these treatments has more than 200 locations in the US and other countries, that the vaccine is one of 11 possible vaccines or treatments that are beginning a phase 3 trial. It's not as though we're running out of options, but we are following the normal process of developing any treatment, and while there are some concerns about it, both insofar as efficacy and safety is concerned, we're also following all of the standard procedures in development of a novel treatment. Going now from CCP-related news to astronomical news. Yet again this year, we can expect to see a low-orbit crash between two no longer functional satellites. This is a problem. Although the satellites are no longer functional, when they do crash, they're going to throw debris everywhere. This debris can cause a number of issues, particularly if it hits other satellites. The outcome from this is far more significant than the loss of a discarded Chinese rocket stage and a defunct Russian military satellite. The idea that they could take out many other satellites is a serious issue. It doesn't need to be much debris from the crash. Small things, especially considering the lightweight design of satellites, can easily cause catastrophic damage, and to an extent, we could see a chain reaction of several satellites causing more and more damage each time. At the moment, it's anticipated they will pass within 12 meters of each other. The issue with it is that the Russian Paris satellite has a long beam coming out of it. It's nearly 17 meters in length. This is what could easily hit the discarded rocket system. In other space-related news, we have a slight update on the ISS. The International Space Station has had oxygen supply issues. Specifically, a module within the Russian part of the space station has failed. Fortunately, there's a backup system in the American part of the space station. This problem has been compounded by the addition of 3 more crew, 2 Russian astronauts and an American. This means there are now 6 people on the ISS, which has been leaking atmosphere for nearly a year. This leak has now been tracked down to a possible specific location, but the new crew also came with new equipment to specifically identify where the leak is coming from. These issues are all compounded by the fact that the Russian modules are well and truly past their use-by date. Normally, most of the modules are given a specific service life. In the case of the Russian parts, this is about 15 years. Most of these parts have now been up there for nearly 20 years, and this would be one reason why we are seeing it increasingly showing problems where it is breaking down. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.